Okay, we need to change the resolution. So we're going to stop, cancel. Here we go. Yeah, for this one, I think we're gonna probably make people quite mad. This we're gonna be basically talking about how basically feminism has really been a cancer and really kind of wrecked the West. And for this, we need to really look at the way what feminism really is, and it's not what a lot of people think it is. It's historically, it's actually needs to be distinctly separated from the ideas of what people think of as women's rights, because feminism is really, when we look at it, it needs to be understood as something that is based on a Marxist theory, and that's the whole point. And women's rights was actually just itself as this women's equality, and that this actually emanates well before Marxist theory actually came about. And the feminism itself is basically just the women's version, women's basically perspective of Marxist theory, and that's really nothing more than that. And it just basically puts a feminine spin upon that, and that's what needs to be understood, because it views the whole idea of the same theories of it, of that there is, when it comes monetarily, that there is no actual gain on any money. And you'll see the same thing with it. They don't believe in actual voluntary exchange in feminism, and this is what you'll see in a lot of in college classes. And when we get, and this is what has actually leached into online, into even online debates, and into actually Western culture, because they've started to teach people a lot of these things, and it's leached into having people read into things what males are what they think males are thinking on a statement, and not just taking things at the actual value of the words. I mean, I had a basic statement out yesterday, and it was really benign in its actual nature, and people were reading into it, and I was getting very, very derogatory comments back, and the actual head of the feed, who's actually a gamer, actually said I was bullying, when there was nothing of the sort, when it was very, very benign. It was basically on the idea of breast implants leading to potential illness because of leakage. And I stated that basically that women should basically not go through with the idea of breast implants, and just be happy with their bodies themselves. And if they wanted to do any changes to their body, just do it naturally through dieting. And there was a whole big blow up. And I don't. This is actually on Twitter. It's not on Facebook. With it, Facebook usually, it's real hard to get a blow up on Facebook for anything like that. I think Twitter is a lot easier. It seems like they'll blow up over anything. on there, and it doesn't seem to be as accurate of a depiction of the way uh, things tend to develop. I think Facebook is a little more accurate to the way things kind of develop naturally across the nation, or at least across the world, because you're getting a little bit more of an even spectrum instead of just being more dominated with Americans. So when you get dominated from Americans and people out of the West, you're going to get something where you're going to get this type of professional victimhood, and it just gets absurd when you get these people doing this. It's like, oh my God, he said X. Well, what does that mean? You need to look exactly what the statement says and take it at face value, and that's what nobody's doing. Nobody's taking these statements at face value, and when people do that, when people actually take statements at face value, they're going to realize that 99% of these things are not offensive, and what they're actually responding back is highly offensive. Because if you look at basically what responses I was getting back, it was either things that were highly sexist, and those things were basically not viewed. There were people that were basically stating things that were basically very, very sexist, and those weren't getting negative comments. Those were actually getting likes from these other people that would basically view it as like feminist type of people. And to me, I think sexist comments should not be viewed as being positive. And then you were getting other things from other people that were very, very derogatory. They were just flat out insults. And when we look at online, we need to actually just get flat out treat people with the actual direct statements, because you can't actually see the actual inflections of the voice to when we talk from person to person, as in person, from when we actually see face to face. So when we actually deal with text, you need to take it actually at face value. You cannot read into anything. And this is the whole point. We cannot assume intention or anything like this. We need to assume it at face value. And that's something that a lot of people, I think, in the West miss on how to deal with online and these different things, because they just are very, very naive in how to deal with one another on these social media sites. Now, obviously, you need to be a little bit skeptical of people in meeting and such like that, but you shouldn't be second guessing someone's intentions in an actual debate, and start assuming what they're thinking, and start making assumptions on these whole points. And that's what's going on. And we need to actually change that whole thing of what we're doing. And what we're seeing out here is that people are not doing this. And that's a major factor in what's happening in society. And we're seeing that the way people are going is that we're seeing that um, we're seeing that basically is that that people are basically out there and judging people in the West on a basic standard of basically judging them on a standard of how we deal with one another on this. Let me create this idea of what I think in my head, what your actual intentions on your text are, what your text of what you're written are, regardless of if it's accurate or not. Now it could be completely erroneous, but you're going to create this idea of what in your head, what they actually mean in what they wrote on a little text box. It could be on Twitter where it's 150 characters or unlimited characters on one of the other social media sites, and this is completely irrational. And this is what we get with some of these with what was coming out of what's coming out of this idea of radical feminism, because we have radical feminism saying you can't talk about females and anything of their bodies. Well, I thought we agreed on something in the West of free speech. It's a common idea. This means you are free to speak on any topic no matter what, and it's a common phrase with it. It doesn't matter with it. It should be males can speak about females, females can speak about males, you can speak about government topics, whatever the topic you want to speak about, no matter how controversial. And when we're doing this is when we start limiting it and saying, you can't talk about that because you have X. Well, what are we doing? We're actually, from a society, we're actually starting to put limitations on ourselves based on these arbitrary reasons, and it's absurd. I mean, are we actually going to do this because of some type of movement? And this is why we actually look at this idea of feminism as being Marxist, because the idea is to limit speech, and speech is one of the cornerstones of a free society. And you don't, and in Marxism, you don't want a free society. You want an actually severely limited society, and that this is what the whole point is. What distinguishes feminism from women's rights? In women's rights, you're not going to care about who's talking about what. You just want equality from one point to the next. You're looking for an egalitarian society, which means a woman is free to do what she wants, a man's free to do what they want, and so on and so forth. Because you're just looking at the biological point of view with it. We're not going to go into any of the other stuff because we're just looking at biology here. And we're not going to go into the other stuff because that's a completely other issue. And when it comes down to that, we'll go into that in another day, and I'll probably get into trouble for that one because just the way things go, and I'll probably try to do it on a live stream because I don't know how a video will react with that, because they'll probably try and block me for my statements, because depending on how they react, it's just how things go with it, because of the politics of the nature and the politicization on it. And when we start talking about medical topics, they tend to go haywire because medical topics have been politicized now, and it just gets real bad. But back to that, with it, that's why we see a difference between feminism and women's rights. Because women's rights, you'll see people like Ayn Rand, and going back before her, you'll see Abigail Adams. These are people that are cornerstones in women's rights. Feminism, you see people like Margaret Sanger, the people. The woman who basically wanted to eliminate all blacks and all colored people from the world. You see a lot of eugenicists. You see Um, Basically, you see Andrea Dworkin, basically a woman who basically had this idea of limited freedom. And these are these people of feminism. Feminism is limited freedom. And that's what people need to realize. Feminism is not freedom, it's limited freedom. They tell you what you have access to and what you don't. Women's rights, you have unlimited freedom. Now, obviously, it's within the scope of the of where everyone where your freedom ends at the start of someone else's, so you can't violate someone else's freedom. And that's why the idea of abortion is technically not because you're not, it's not your body with it, because it is someone else's life. And that's why we start talking about that, and they go, oh, it's my body. Well, it's technically not, because that would be essentially the equivalent of saying of a husband trying to kill his wife and saying, hey, it's my wife. That argument doesn't fit. And that's why we look at that point. And because the actual DNA is different, and you can't make that argument. And that's why we look to science for that argument. And you can't make that argument, because when the DNA is different, you can't say it's your body, because the DNA is not the same. It might be in your body, but it isn't your body. And that's the whole point. And this is where we get to the points of why feminism is really a problem. Is we're talking that people are really just really out of the West is just really become very, very destructive to society. And then you'll come up with these people who end up saying, "Oh, I can't find a good man," or this, that, and the other. Well, when you start acting in a very, very destructive manner, and start treating people in such a negative way, and assuming what people are thinking, and this socially destructive way, this socially destructive attitude, you're going to realize that you're not going to find people that are actually going to want to be around you for a long time, because that's the way relationships are built. And eventually your relationships are going to be destroyed because of this. And that's what ends up happening with this idea of feminism. Is feminism, you're not going to create actually legitimate relationships. And this is just a fact. When you do this, you're going to create it's going to create a lot of uh, toxic type of situations, because you're essentially creating tension between everyone. And people don't like when you're essentially assuming what they're thinking, and not and essentially trying to create this lower level of freedom for free speech, and lower level of freedom between the sexes, and they're not going to appreciate that. So when if you are a straight individual, you're going to find out that it's not going to be fun finding someone else out there. Now, you're probably going to find you're probably going to find these males out there who are basically going to pander to you. Now, it's going to last a little bit of time with it, but eventually you're going to get to the point to find out that they're just looking to get you into the bed, and that's about it. And then they're just pandering to you, and that's about it. And I hate to tell you, but those ones aren't reliable, and you're going to realize, oh, how come I can't find a decent male? Well, because you kind of keep pissing them off. I hate to tell these people, but if you want to find someone decent, you're going to have to actually reciprocate, and in relationships, and actually go out there and treat people decently. this is the way relationships work. Is it doesn't matter with it if you want to actually develop a relationship with people, either friends or people just in general. You cannot assume what they actually mean. And this is something that I'm finding with people out there, is people out in the West. We're finding lower numbers of marriage out there, and there's a reason why, is because of this expansion of this feminism, and when we're finding more and more applications for overseas fiancés, it's showing that basically that males here do not believe in the quality of females here. It's not based on beauty. It's based on exterior beauty. It's based solely on interior beauty, because we don't because males here do not believe that they're willing to put up with people who are not going to essentially reciprocate on the actual relationship from an actual personal level, and you're going to essentially lose all those people. Now, it doesn't mean all of all of the males out there are like this, or all the females are out there like this, but there's a limited scope of females out there uh, who are going to basically be more normal. And this means that because there is such a wide spanning of these ones who support this idea of this feminism out there, which is really just relationship destroying, of actually just when it comes to this voluntary interaction, it causes this problem of the way that you would want to basically develop a relationship with someone else, either romantic or just personal, with friends or business. It causes problems that later on down the road that you can't really fix. And this is the whole point that needs to be brought up. And you're not going to fix the problem by just assuming that you're going to go out there and basically act the same way that you've always been acting, and it's not going to do it. You can't say, oh, men can't say this because they don't have X body part. Well, it doesn't matter. We have free speech, and you can take advice from anyone with it. And if it doesn't matter what type of statement they're coming from, sometimes a new perspective is good. I mean, if you're going to make that statement that men shouldn't be making decisions on these things, I guess we should be overturning Roe v. Wade, because that was made by all men. And so I guess elective abortion should no longer be available. And how I don't think the feminist argument would exactly appreciate that one. And so when it comes to that, then they would start screaming if we actually started saying that, or that's all the decisions made by made within the FDR administration and the Woodrow Wilson administration should be overturned, such as income tax. Income tax should no longer be labeled as constitutional. We should overturn that. Especially with a lot of these, they want these high income taxes for the rich. They also want to push for the because a lot of these are Bernie supporters, and we see that a lot of them are supporters of the welfare state, and they think we should have more welfare. So when we start bringing up these points, they start freaking out. And the fact is, I mean, you can't have it both ways. Either A, they're allowed to discuss these points, or B, they're not. If we're going to basically, if you're going to be consistent on an issue, be consistent. And if you're going to state that males can't discuss them, then we're going to have to go back and go back with these decisions, and all decisions that males were actually made uh, in the courts that impacted women are going to have to be overturned. This even means women's rights to vote. So guess what? You can't vote anymore. You can't vote. Um, you can't vote, and you can't have abortions. No access to birth control. None of that, because that was actually decided by men. Guess what? That's all over because that was made solely by men. And it's, I mean, if you want to make that decision on these things, I mean, you can make that decision. But the fact is that's the way things have been done in this nation. But if you actually want to be rational and say that anybody can discuss these issues, like actually rational people, and say uh, and actually allow people to discuss these issues, because and actually take people at face value and get back to an actual normal nation, and instead of saying oh, you voted for XYZ, so you're subhuman, or blah 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 blah, and start tossing out these blank insults, I think we can actually get back to some normalcy. Because frankly, I think we're talking that there's a lot of people out there who are completely insane because they're obsessed over politics. Uh, they're willing to go and commit acts of violence over politics, and basically they're obsessed over an actual slogan. They try to find what it called. They try to find maybe one person who basically uh, is just kind of a little bit obsessed over a slogan. So they basically that doesn't represent it. So they basically assume that assume that it's racist or something, and then to make the assumption that a slogan is racist, they they also go out and do this stuff to basically break down actually human society, and it's stupid. And it's why we find other cultures around the globe, especially in East Asia, that don't do this garbage. You're not gonna find stuff out in East Asia that are doing this stuff because they realize how much uh, how laughable it is and how it's kind of stupid that they would never do this hogwash. And they know how it's kind of insane that we as Western countries, being either in Europe or in the North America, that we're actually doing this hogwash, and that it kind of makes us look laughable, and that we're actually falling for this garbage. Because many of the countries out there dealt with Marxism, and they rejected it, and they eventually rejected it. Yes, there's still China and North Korea, but most of the other countries have rejected this garbage. Uh, and when it comes down to when we start actually accepting some of these stupid ideas, they're basically realizing, what are you doing? And they're basically saying, you have this good foundation, and you can actually build upon it by actually eliminating some of the things that were done during the progressive era, and get back to what needs to be done by actually essentially taking what was done during the 1900s and eliminating that, and it'll make it better. If you take what was done during the 1900s and completely eliminate those social justice programs, and basically just just basically say we're going to have essentially the equal rights of these people, but just eliminate the social justice programs of these things, of this spending of the money, and get rid of the foreign policy of the what we've done in the 1900s, and get rid of the domestic spending of the 1900s. You're going to realize of the 1900s to current and all this other garbage. You're going to realize that this is where we should be, and that's what we should be doing, and getting down to an actual gold or silver currency, and that's what we were meant to be, and that's the whole point to begin with. And when it comes down to it, is that's what we're not doing. And we have these insane people that were leaders, such as FDR, Woodrow Wilson, to blame for it. We go back to and then now we're actually being infiltrated by radical feminists out there that basically have actually destroyed a lot of the culture. And this is not something new. This is something that's actually happened over the last 100 or so years, that has actually occurred, and it's actually kind of leaked through the system. And I think it's kind of at its near peak, that we need to kind of make the decision: which way are we going? Are we going to completely destroy our actual way of communicating with each other and actually running as a society, or are we going to basically be complete and utter barbarians and basically try and kill each other? And that's where we are at, because I mean, as I saw on social media yesterday, it looked like we're just going to act like complete and utter barbarians and try to kill each other. It doesn't matter if it's verbally or physically, because it doesn't seem like we're much better either way, because we see people doing it in the streets because of gang violence, and we see people doing it and then through mass shootings because they get fired, or people hoaxing crimes because they lost their job on a show. And we see we see all this garbage going on, and when it comes down to it, is this is what's going on, and it all boils down into this kind of cultural warfare that really is kind of emanating out of the West. It's really based off this Marxist theory, and it's really kind of, it's this feminism. It's kind of this coming from it, and it's actually, feminism is Marxist from this total point. Then but if we compare that with what's going on in certain countries out of the East, we're seeing complete opposites of that, where they're breaking out in more ideas of being a lot more culturally aware. They're going with a lot more free speech. They're going with a lot more openness, and that's what's happening. They're not they're not accepting to these ideas, and you're seeing that people are out there free to do what they want to do. And when they actually are exposed to ideas like this, they're just flabbergasted that people would even act in such a manner. They would say, "What are you doing, you morons?" And they're basic. I mean, my fiance lives in the Philippines, and when I showed her some of these posts, she was just like basically blown away that they would even take this in such a negative way. And that shows you right there that this was just absurd. That one of my posts was one of my, actually, sorry, replies was taken away, where they accused where the thread leader was assuming as bullying, when it was basically nothing more than just really a benign reply, and that's the whole point. And when we look at this, is if we're going to the point of basically taking benign replies on threads and basically basically making the statement of saying it's bullying, we've got a serious problem because it means we're reading into things that aren't there. And if people out of the East are actually saying that there's nothing there and that people are overreacting, then we know that there's basically some serious problems with uh, actually discourse within the West. And I think this is something that needs to be understood when we're dealing with people out of the West itself. Is we need to start reevaluating what we're actually doing, and that's something that I think needs to be understood. Is we'll have people out of the West that just don't understand what's going on with what our culture is happening. They're gonna say, "Oh, it's feminism. Oh, it's just a pro-woman movement, and oh, it's for equality for all." Well, I'm not seeing number one. I'm not seeing equality for all. That's number one. Number two is, it's for the benefit of women. Well, how is the benefit for women? Because number one is I'm just seeing a breakdown of society. Because if it's a breakdown of society, that's not a benefit for anyone. That's a loss for everyone. And we're just seeing basically mob rule and people acting like savages out there, and it is trying to basically attack one another because of a statement that was taken out of context, uh, or basically opinions that are not popular. That's not uh, that's not what we're talking with being positive for women or positive for everyone. That's if that's what feminism is, it needs to go. And that's the definition of what they're using as feminism, because you cannot have an actual destruction of society. Because if you add that with it, then we're talking. That's why, if you look at it, that's why it goes back to Marxism, because you want the government controlled, because you want that destruction of society. Because once you have the destruction of society, you could say these people aren't mature enough to have freedom. You need to take away 100% of their freedom, and then we can control them and tell them what they're allowed to say, and that's why it actually boils down to Marxism, and that's why when you see feminism, it actually boils down to that. It actually comes from that, and this is why we find these whole points to begin with. It's not because of the fact is I'm just pulling this out of my backside. It's that's where it comes down to it. You even have Marxist. That's why when you have Marxist uh, foreign relations theory, foreign relations perspectives, right below that as an actual sub foreign relations perspective, you have feminism foreign relations perspective. There's a reason why, and it's solely because their feminism is actually a part of Marxism, and they're actually one and the same. Feminist theory, the idea of feminism is a Marxist theory. It's not about equality. It's not about any of this stuff. It's actually about a basically a variant of Marxism based on using the theory of women to basically control people, and they'll use the point of saying, "Oh, we're fighting for women's equality." Well, you're not really. You're basically using a myth of women's equality, because they'll use with Marxism they'll always use the term equality, but what they're doing is they're actually fighting for nobody's equality and trying to bring everybody down just so they can have control, and it all boils down into that control. And that's the whole point that we're talking about here is when we have this idea of this feminism that's energy, that's basically hit its near peak in the West, it's basically what we're talking about here is this is why we see it's near at its boiling point, and we need to make a decision. Are we going to have feminism, or are we going to have women's rights? If we're going to have women's rights and actually act like civilized human beings and say anybody is free to talk about whatever topic they want, whether it's men's health, women's health, men's issues, women's issues, whatever topic you want to talk about, and actually act like civilized adults, um, we can actually live as an actual society and be sane and not just do little childish attacks. And this is what I've noticed is they end up resorting to very, very childish attacks. But if we're going to basically say, oh, you can't talk about that because you're a man, well, okay, if we take that point of view, I've already explained that we have to start taking away women's right to vote, women's right to contraceptions, because contraceptions can't be allowed as being legal, and we have to take away the legality of public aid. We have to take the legality of also abortion as well. I don't think they're going to want that one either. Then they go, oh, no, 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 we don't want that. So it tends to be subjective. And that this is always the case with it, where they don't want stuff of the past being taken away that was decided by males, but it's just now. All of a sudden now with it, it's those males were just fine making the decisions, but now all of a sudden it's becomes a problem. Now when we look at this, we see that basically is when we get to these people is that if we start going down, we keep going down this path, we're going to basically get to the point to where they're going to say, oh, we need to basically create a complete and utter, fully socially controlled system because these people are acting out of control, and we need to severely limit speech, and it's going to be basically PC on steroids, and this is going to be the whole thing, and you need to submit what you're going. They're going to put huge moderators on stuff with it. So if you want to essentially be able to write what you want to write on social media with that's not overseen by government and basically go into re-education camps, you better what I call it, pretty much reject this idea of feminism, because the fact is that's what's going to happen. And because this is the idea of what's going out there. Because I'm not saying reject women's rights with it or treat women negatively. I'm saying the opposite. You should treat women with respect. But the fact is this is where we're going. We're going with basically a complete and utter destroyed society, where nobody can actually voluntarily interact with one another. And that should be the whole point, is people interacting with one another voluntarily. That's what I want in actual society. I want voluntary interactions. And we're not going to get that. We're going to get coerced interactions if we get to this point. And if we get to the breaking point. And that's where we're getting very, very close to, especially with some of these socialists running in government. And they're going to essentially cause coercion. And they're going to say, well, your speech is going to be limited. We've even seen people say, oh, because of the First Amendment, I can't limit speech, but I want to limit speech. We've already had people state that. There's been Ted Lieu already. I believe he's from California. He's already stated this. I mean, so we've already had people state this in the actual government. So we're real close, and this is a real big danger. So if you keep acting like this and acting like morons on social media and basically try to view stuff that's not there on people's posts and act like morons and try to basically gang up on people and try to insult them instead of just basically acting like civilized human beings and look for voluntary interaction. You're going to get this. This is going to be the outcome because you can't actually create some type of civil discourse between people if we're for actual solutions in society and actual discussions on topics and actual legitimate debate if we're going to act like this. Because you're just going to basically get a bunch of childish, uh, uh, if you're just going to act like little childish babies and do this, what's going to happen is the government is basically just going to become larger and larger, and they're just going to say, you know what, you don't need free speech anymore, and you're basically going to see what China has. They're going to do it. They're basically going to establish this social credit score, and that's what we're going to see. We're going to see limited access online. You're not going to have all the access to the information you once had, and this is no longer going to be a free country. It's going to be a complete and utter nightmare. And if that's what you want, that's what you're going to get. And that whole thing of oh, I want clean air to breathe. Yeah, guess what? You're not going to get that anymore. It's going to be everything's going to be horrible. Nothing is going to be nice anymore. Everything is going to be a complete utter nightmare. You're not going to find anything nice to buy in the stores. You're not going to find any food on the shelves. And it's because you are actually pursuing this idea of saying, oh, I wanted feminism. And it all started there. Just because you were telling such and such a male that they didn't have a right to speak on a topic, just because you were actually pursuing this and acting like a complete and utter animal. That's the way it actually starts. Instead of actually acting like a normal, actual civilized person that actually could actually have actual discourse on an actual topic that actually was really something simple. Instead of saying what it got from an actual person trying to run the actual thing, instead of actually taking control of it, you could have actually dealt with the actual people and actually told them to stop the BS, or instead of the actual other people in the actual topic, maybe actually acting like civilized human beings. I don't know. Maybe some of the actual males in the actual topic, maybe actually, I don't know, actually growing a pair and actually stating and actually kind of stating the actual piece of like you should be able to state anything you want, and actually upholding the idea of free speech, which only one other male did by liking my statement. But beyond that is it was just basically a bunch of complete and this was male that had MBA, which was basically, I guess, the only other male that had a master's degree in the whole post, and he was from England, and it shows that basically is that. It shows that basically we're talking that we need people who are actually going to be civilized out there, because otherwise the society is gone. And it doesn't matter what we have out there. We need to actually have people who are willing to work and be able to be willing to deal with tough topics. And when you start to censor things, you're going to get all types of censorship. You don't just get one type of censorship. And that's the whole point that needs to be reiterated right here, is that you don't get to choose the type of censorship. The government's going to take everything. And this isn't some type of conspiracy theory. This is basically looking at history. Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution was a relatively free nation. when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, they basically turned into the Soviet Union, and they became a horrible, horrible place to live very, very quickly, because they started under Lenin and then went to Stalin after that, and many, many people died. And that's what happens under Marxism. You look at what China had previous to Marxism, and people lived in relative harmony in that system. It might have been a farming nation for the most part, but they lived in harmony. Then they actually changed over. Yes, they didn't. Yes, they dealt with other nations, sometimes having to deal with war, but that was no different than any other situation. And since then, they've just been dealing with hell because of what the problems of communism are. And this continues when you look at these nations, and it's just horrible. Even even Cuba, as bad as the Batista regime was, for as crony as it was, it still was better than what they deal with under Castro. I mean, people are just trying to get out. I mean, you have baseball players who are essentially considered the top of the food chain when it comes to treatment in the system, and they're even leaving to some. They're even leaving the country to basically sometimes staying out in other countries until they can get into the United States to play baseball. And this is the case. Sometimes they're staying in some of these really, really bad areas in Mexico to basically come to the United States, and that's that's sometimes the case. and and this is what we're seeing. And so they're willing to basically risk their lives just to play baseball in the United States, because life in Cuba is so bad, and these are the people getting the best treatment, and you can imagine what people getting the worst treatment are getting. And when we look at this, and this is basically what's going to be headed for the United States, so the people getting the best treatment are essentially not going to be happy. The people getting the worst treatment are going to be horribly off. I mean, the poorest people right now are essentially going to be much better off now than they are going to be under any type of Marxist system, because at least they can say whatever they want to say for the most part right now, except for if they run into one of these radical feminist type of people that basically say you don't have the right to talk about that topic. And that this is the point. We should not be doing this. We should not be we should not be self-censoring any group. This is this garbage. This is how societies destroy themselves. You destroy yourself by basically trying to limit the freedom of the actual people within the society. You destroy them by basically extending the actual empire, and then you destroy them through actually poor monetary policy. Those three things, and that's exactly the three things that we're doing. And when we do that, is you're going to destroy your actual thing. And you have these morons, these feminist morons, who are actually oblivious to the other two, who are more concerned with they want to make sure that they're censoring everyone, while the government is doing some of the other stuff to censor people, as well as some of the social media people are censoring people. Then you actually have, in the other aspect, you'll have people that are you have our monetary policy, which is as horrible because we're borrowing stuff in which they're totally oblivious to. They have no idea what's going on with that, and they don't even want to learn about that. They're more interested in other issues that are just completely irrelevant. Then when it comes down to war, they're completely irrelevant because they don't even follow any news. They're more interested in stupid garbage. And this is the whole point. They're following stupid garbage when it comes down to that. They're not even following any relevant news, and don't even understand what the actual Constitution is. And this is why we get morons like AOC in office, and why we get people who have no idea what the Constitution is, who have no idea what an actual legitimate monetary theory is. She tries to bring up the modern monetary theory, which essentially has no idea of how currencies interact with one another. She has no idea that actually the only legitimate theory is actually the Austrian theory, that actually deals with an actual constitution theory. It is actually constitutional because it actually deals with actually printing gold and silver for our coins, because it does not say anything about printing paper. It says the Congress has the authority to coin money. Coin is actually very, very specific of a term. And while we have these radical feminists that are kind of going off on a tangent of talking about these dumb issues uh, about abortion and about this, that, and the other, they're basically going off and raising the debt, which is a huge national security risk, and they're talking about these other stupid ass issues. And that's the whole point that needs to be brought up. Is they're more interested in their Marxist theory than they're actually and basically allowing people to essentially bully others for having their ideas misrepresented. Uh, then and then claim that the person who is getting essentially bullied is essentially the bully, and then just to most often what I think the reason was essentially protect their own higher number of viewers, higher number of viewers on YouTube, which is the person who reacts is mainly on YouTube, and they've actually shown concern about numbers of people on YouTube staying. So I think that's more their concern. They'd rather they'd rather kind of sacrifice one than sacrifice like 20 or 30. So I assume that's their concern. They'd rather sacrifice one of the dogs than 30. So they figure if they lose one, it's not as big of a deal as losing 30. So instead of actually going after the people who are wrong, I figured that's the actual excuse. So it's not as much that they're actually on this idea, is more that they're actually essentially playing coward. So they better essentially go on the idea of essentially pander to these feminist types than actually doing the other stuff. I see them as being more of just being kind of very, very ignorant to the issues out there of all these issues that are going on socially in the world, and that's why I think what we find with this YouTuber. I'm not going to go into specifically who they are with it, because that would be completely wrong. I don't like dragging people's names in the mud like that. That's completely wrong and an immoral thing to do. Because if they were just acting basically to essentially just protect their own advertising revenue, then whatever, they're making their own business decision. But even as technically business as ethically wrong as it would be, technically it's their own decision to make. But that's basically what decisions people have to make out there, and they just do what decisions they want to make. Seeing that they didn't report me as actual bullying, but it made the blanket accusation. I think that's what we're talking about here. and but it still shows, but it's still what this still is showcasing a serious social problem. And what we're finding, and I think what we find with it is Twitter's more of a problem out there, because Twitter tends to be this mob rule system where people will tend to gang up on an individual. This is what I've seen. And it doesn't matter which side we're talking about. I've seen people on the right, people on the left. That's what I noticed, and that's just yesterday alone. I mean, people just who disagree with the Trump decision. I mean, I disagreed on his decision on declaring an emergency on the wall, saying it's unconstitutional because he was using the idea of if it's under decision under the Department of Defense, and yet it's actually under the idea of Department of Homeland Security. They would actually build the wall anyway, which means that it's actually technically not even under the right department. This means that he's technically not even doing it lawfully, because he's doing it under decision under Department of Defense and claiming it's national security. Well, that's not national security. Under that national the and saying it's what it goes, saying it's under law under the military construction. Well, that's not a military construction. A military construction would actually be such as a thing as a base. Then if we look at such what the wall would be a construction from the Department of Homeland Security. These are different types of structures. Even though the Army Corps of Engineers would look over for soundness and environmental concerns, but Army Corps of Engineers does this for many different things. They do this things such as bridges in different areas, even just a bridge in the middle of the country. Army Corps of Engineers will look over for environmental soundness and structure capabilities. I mean, and it doesn't have to be anything when it comes to military construction. So when they use that, I was seeing them use that type of excuse. Well, that's completely illegitimate. When it comes down to the actual constitutional argument, that's not a constitutional argument. And so you'll find people on that just gang up on you on that end with it. So it ends up being where I think Twitter is more of this idea where they tend to gang up on you for these points. And this is what I'm seeming to notice, where Twitter is this system to where people just socially do this, and it's a little bit less representative of society, how things build a little bit slower, as opposed to what we notice on like Facebook or YouTube. And that's what we see with those. But that's those seem to be a little bit more natural in their building. And I think because the 150 I don't know if it's with the 150 characters that people tend to want to think they can act a little more boldly or what. But or if or when news pieces come out on these things, that people think that they can kind of act in such a way that they can, that they can act more rationally, but it's just a matter of what ends up going on. But I still think overall is what I've said yesterday and what I said today on this is that we're finding something, at least on Twitter. I mean, it's something that's very, very disturbing. But I think overall, this is just something overall that it's just something culturally that's just very, very unsettling from the West. And I think this through this mix of this like Trump fandom and this feminism is just something that's just not healthy, because we need people who are more objective out there and making their own decisions freely, to actually uh, decide out there and start interacting voluntarily, and actually to decide on society. Because we don't need people that are actually drones making decisions. Then that's not a smart way to function. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure that one out. And I don't think that's uh, stupid of a decision out there to make, because we can look out there and state that's the best type of interaction is going to be the most voluntary interaction between people. Now, I feel like this discussion, you can kind of give it thumbs up and like it, share it around, and I will probably do another one on this with it, because frankly I'm just done with Periscope, because when that goes on Twitter, and Twitter's just a bunch of crazies right now. I might go back to Periscope later, but right now we have a bunch of crazies out there, so kind of done with them for a little bit. And I will see you guys later with my post here on the Civil War. Bye, everyone.